Now, as we get started here this morning, just want to say right up front, I know this has been a tumultuous week here for us in America, and my prayer for us here at Awaken, my prayer for this church is that this would be a place of healing for all people. That's why we started Awaken, that's why I started Awaken, and why Awaken continues to exist. So I know this week has brought up many different emotions for people, many different thoughts and feelings. And my prayer as we gather here this morning is that this would be a place of peace and healing for everyone. Now, today we are in the second week of our series on King Solomon. Today, the title of our sermon is Solomon's Temple. I'll say this, I walked away from the sermon last week and immediately thought, oh my goodness, I had like 15 sermons in last week's sermon. Probably could have taken that one sermon and made it into 15 different sermons. Then today, or this week, I was finalizing this sermon, and the amount of notes, especially the notes that were cut from this sermon, I probably had enough for 17 more sermons. So I tried to narrow it down. It's going to be a high view here of the temple, but I realized, my goodness, we could talk about the temple because there's so much about the temple all throughout the Bible, what it means, its significance, and maybe we'll get back to it at some point, but just so you're aware, there's a lot that is left on the cutting floor this week. But with that being said, I do want to look at Solomon's temple, and two of the questions that I want to address here this morning is, how does religion get corrupted? And then how do we reclaim true worship? Because when we talk about the temple, and specifically Solomon's temple that we'll be looking at this morning, these issues are front and center. It begins, well, actually I would argue it begins even before Solomon puts up the temple and builds the temple. But this whole idea of the temple, does God desire the temple and its significance, is something that is packed all throughout Scripture. But specifically, here are the two questions that I want to address this morning. Now, last week I mentioned a book. It's by Walter Brueggemann, an amazing Old Testament scholar, Solomon. Kind of gives away the idea of the book, the main topic. It's all about Solomon. If you're looking for a book, a little deeper dive into Solomon, this is the book for you. And this book in particular has helped to shape this sermon this morning. As I mentioned, Solomon, his major achievement, we might say, is the temple. In Kings and Chronicles, the two places where we are told the story of Solomon, there is much space dedicated to the building of the temple. Here's an artist's rendering of the temple. Maybe this is AI. Don't know exactly how this was put together. But here is what Solomon's temple would have looked like. Quite amazing. This is something that if you are approaching, because pilgrims would have traveled from all around to go and visit this temple, whether for festivals, to go and make sacrifices, you see this from a distance and you are awed by its beauty. And as if that isn't beautiful enough, here's a picture of what the inside would have looked like. Lots and lots of gold. This was quite ornate. Now, temples, let's start here. Temples in the ancient world, they were highly symbolic. Before we get to talking about Solomon's temple specifically, let's talk about temples in the ancient world generally, because this plays into what the temple was all about, why it was built, and what it meant for the Israelites and how we can take it and interpret it for our lives this morning. First, ancient temples symbolized order. When a temple was put up, it symbolized that all was right in the world. Choose your favorite god, Ishtar, Baal, Marduk, whichever ancient god is your favorite. Whenever there was a temple put up for that particular god, what it signified is that that god was in control. So when the temple was organized, when it was flowing smoothly, it told everyone who lived in that area that that particular god was in control, that all was right in the world. When we talk about Solomon's temple, we're talking about the god Yahweh. With the erecting of this temple, basically all the Israelites would have believed that Yahweh was in control everything was right with the world. Order was being maintained. The temple was a symbol of stability, and we all want stability in life. We all want to know that things are moving along the way in which it's supposed to work. So if a temple is destroyed, well, then it would have created all this instability because the people would have believed, well, this God is no longer in control. What solid ground can I stand on? So temple, first, symbol of stability. Second, it was a symbol of political power. The temple was commissioned by the king. The king would put up a temple to let everyone know, I'm in charge. I have the power. And what's actually really interesting, I found this out over the past week, during this time, when Solomon's temple would have been built in the 10th century BCE, there was a shift from palaces, ancient palaces being built, to ancient temples being built in the ancient world. So Solomon's temple was being put up at a time when temples were being put up all around the ancient world. There was no longer palaces that were now being built for the king, but now it was a temple that symbolized the king, the leader, the nation's power that they had. And as we saw here in the picture, ornate construction, lots of gold, all different resources that would have been shipped in from all around the world. Again, here's our picture of the temple adorned in all its glory. Now, let's talk about Solomon's temple. Let's talk about the temple that we have in the Bible. One of the things that's really, really interesting about the temple that we come across in the Bible is that there is this evolving view about the temple's significance. There wasn't just one idea about the temple and then it stayed static all throughout the Bible, but rather there was this internal ongoing discussion, call it a debate, about what the temple's purpose was. And honestly, whether the temple was even required. 1 Kings chapter 8, when the priests withdrew from the holy place, this is after the temple had been built, the Ark of the Tabernacle was brought into the temple. All the priests brought it there, which was the presence of God, the ark that had been carried around. The cloud filled the temple of the Lord. The priests could not perform their service because of this cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled his temple. Then Solomon said, the Lord has said he would dwell in a dark cloud. I have indeed built a magnificent temple for you, a place to dwell forever. 1 Kings 8. How is the temple being described? What is its purpose? The temple housed God's presence. Why did Solomon build this temple? A place for you to live, to dwell forever. But then, how about this? A few verses later, the same chapter in 1 Kings, Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord in front of everyone because he's dedicating the temple. He spread his hands out toward heaven, and here's what Solomon said. Will God really dwell on earth? So a few verses earlier, he's saying, hey, God's going to come here and dwell in the temple. But now in this magnificent speech that he gives, he asks the question, wait a second, will God really dwell on earth? The heaven, even the highest heaven can't contain you. How much less this temple that I have built? A few verses earlier, hey, this temple is going to house God's presence. Now he offers this speech and he's saying, wait a second, can the temple really house God's presence? Is that really how the thing works? One of the things that you find about the Bible is that the Bible wasn't written by one person. The Bible was written by many different people, and the Bible is a collection of all different ancient traditions. And the people are trying to figure it out together. So sometimes you actually have conflicting views in the Bible because the authors are putting different traditions together and trying to figure out how the whole thing works. So earlier in this chapter, there's one tradition that says, well, we build this temple so that God's presence can dwell here. But now just a few verses later, you have this other tradition that says, well, hold on a second here. Is that really the purpose of the temple? Can you really contain God? Yet, give attention to your servant's prayer and his plea for mercy, Lord my God. Hear the cry, the prayer that your servant is praying in your presence this day. May your eyes be open toward this temple day and night. This place of which you said, my name shall be there. Not my presence, my name shall be here at this temple, so that you will hear the prayer your servant prays toward this place. First way of understanding the temple earlier in 1 Kings, it was where God's presence was housed. Here, now a few verses later, it's not presence, but rather the temple is a place of attentiveness. It's a place where God's eyes are turned toward, where God is listening to the prayers being offered in this particular place. This understanding of the temple then is, well, the temple is a sacred space to meet with God. The temple is a place where you make offerings. You travel to make sacrifices on your behalf. A place where multiple times a year you would go to participate in festivals. The temple now is being understood just simply as a meeting place between you, humanity, and God. In a sense, this is almost like the church. We come here because it is a time that we have set aside to focus our attention on God. We all know that that could happen anywhere, at any time, wherever we are, because chances are you believe that God's presence is everywhere, all throughout the earth. Wherever you go, and we'll get to this a little bit further down in the sermon, but wherever you go, God's presence is with you. But there's a reason you still come to church. You're all here this morning because in some way, this hour that we set aside on a regular basis, it's like a time out from life. It refocuses us. It places our attention on God, because we all know how the week can get. I mean, there's some weeks where we're just barely, I had a week like this, barely keeping your head above water. You ever been there before? And sometimes what happens is you forget about the divine presence that is with you everywhere. Are you like me and you just like going through your week and you're overwhelmed, and then you're like, oh, wait a second, God is here with me, but you kind of forget about it, or it's a nice thing to believe, but you don't really feel it. And so we go to church, we join together as a community because we remind ourselves about this God who is always present. We remind ourselves about this God of grace and mercy and healing. And so church, the temple, this understanding of the temple, it's a place to focus our attention on God. And what Solomon is saying is, hey, in this place here, maybe God's ears and eyes are tuned a little more toward this place. But as you move forward in the Bible, you realize that God's eyes and ears are tuned in everywhere you go. But again, this is this evolving view about the temple. We're dealing with a culture, a way of understanding religion that is 3,000 years old. Our understanding of God has changed in 3,000 years. And I would argue that the Bible highlights this change, this growing, evolving understanding that humanity has about God. And we see that right here in one chapter of the Bible. So all throughout the Bible, there's this inner dialogue. And again, I told you I had like 17 sermons on this, so we're going to break it down into one. But maybe we'll get to like 16 more at some point here if we got like 25 more years together, which I hope we do. You think we do? I think we do. Yeah. All right. Row D is in on it. Now, there's this inner dialogue about the temple's purpose, about religion, about how to connect with God, about what God truly desires from his people. And if you were to trace the ideology of the temple all the way from Genesis 1, because Genesis 1 is all about the temple. Maybe we'll get there in a week or two. I think we are going to. I've decided. But if you trace the ideology of the temple from Genesis 1 to Revelation, you see this ongoing debate. Now, during the dedication of the temple, Solomon has this great religious speech. You have all heard these religious speeches before. Solomon, in front of the entire assembly, he raises his hands. You can see the people behind him. And then we're told this. Then the king, Solomon, all Israel with him, offered sacrifices. 1 Kings 8:62, in case you're following along, offered sacrifices before the Lord. This is comical. Let me explain why. Solomon offered a sacrifice of fellowship offerings to the Lord. How many cattle? 22,000 cattle. Can you imagine the lineup of cattle? 22,000 cattle. Imagine the priests as they're offering these. I mean, after 10, you're like, oh my goodness, I'm done. Still have another 900,000 left to go. Not only that, 120,000 sheep and goats. Yeah. What this verse, this passage is saying is that Solomon held nothing back. He was quite wealthy. He gave it all. He offered it all to God. Was it really that many? There are some people that say, well, yeah, of course. And then there's other scholars, commentators that will say, this is a gross exaggeration. There's no way that this would even be possible. But what this signifies is that there was this immense outpouring of wealth. Solomon had some money. We'll get to that here in another week or so, because you think about Solomon, temple, wisdom, wealth. So we'll cover all those topics here. But here he is, great speech, sounds good. He's saying the right things. He's offering the correct sacrifices. The king, all the Israelites dedicated the temple to the Lord. This, in my opinion, is a religion that looks good on the outside. And this is great. And we all know how to play the game. We all know how to play the church game. We know how to play the religious game. Maybe that face that we put on when we go to church, or if you're in a prayer group, like, you know the right things to say to get those, yes. I mean, Solomon knew the right things to say. He had the right actions. This is a religion that looks good on the outside, but if we dig a little deeper into the building of the temple, what was the temple being built on? Solomon conscripted the descendants of all these people remaining in the land, whom the Israelites could not exterminate, to serve as what? What was the temple being built on? Slave labor. Yeah, Solomon knew all the right things to say, the right prayers to offer, but then he used slaves to build this house for God. If we go back earlier in the story, Exodus chapter 1, they, the Egyptians, put slave masters over the Israelites who oppressed them with forced labor. They built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. We're supposed to be moving forward. We're supposed to be building a city for God that is built on a different foundation than the foundation of empire in Egypt that the Israelites were rescued and escaped from. But in reality, we're simply going backwards. Israel was supposed to be different. They were supposed to live differently than their previous oppressors and slave masters. And yet, we could argue one of the most religious things in the Old Testament, the building of the temple, it was being built on the backs of slaves. This is not moving forward. This is actually moving backward. Israel is now becoming the very thing that they were rescued from. The thing that God brought them out of and said, I want you to be different. I want you to offer a different way to live and to build a society, a different way to work together with all people. And yet now Israel is using slave labor to build the temple. I think you leave this out of your holy book. You would think this isn't the kind of stuff that you put into a holy book. This isn't the things that you're proud of. You don't put it in a yearbook, your accomplishments, greatest hits. No. You leave this out unless you're trying to show where your tradition, where your religion has gone off the tracks and offers a way to then reclaim the true religion. I started Awaken about 15 years ago for many different reasons. And I have talked about these reasons from time to time. Two of the biggest reasons. First, and this is well documented, we've talked about this quite a bit. Unfortunately, Christians in the wider world are often known more for what they're against than what they're for. And I think this is wrong. I think this needs to be corrected. And I think Christians should be known for what they are for. If any of your friends who is not a Christian were to meet a Christian, my hope, my prayer, why I started Awaken, is that they would think, well, a Christian, yeah, sure, I know a Christian. They're about love. They're about forgiveness. They're about mercy and about grace and about including everyone. Unfortunately, that isn't the case, but I started Awaken because I wanted to create a place together where we could help to change the script. We could change the narrative, change others' understandings about what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And then one of the other things that I really set out to do, I realized this in many of the different church conferences that I went to, and I stopped going to church conferences early on because what I realized is there was no depth to many of these conferences. I would go and listen to speakers. They would be on a stage and they would say all the right things. They would get the amens, the hands raised. They had the right bumper stickers, slogans. They had their merch in the back that you could go and buy. You could wear a t-shirt, hat, you could get that bumper sticker. But I would walk away and I would say, what in the world was I listening to? Like, that sounds great, but it wasn't applicable to where I was, and it didn't help me process my life and my faith. And so I wanted to help create a place where there was a little more digging, a little more depth, to help people wrestle with the everyday questions that we have, and not just to throw up a great slogan or a sticky phrase or something, which those can be helpful, of course, yes. If you want a bumper sticker, a tattoo, awesome, go for it. Please, go and do this. But I was realizing that there was more depth to the tradition that wasn't being offered. And so I wanted to create a place where we could explore the depths together. I mean, here's Solomon. On the outside, it looks great. And much of religion, it can look great on the outside, but in reality, underneath, this is what was going on. Sorry for the watermark or whatever, the copyright right here, but I mean, I just love this picture. I had to go with it because you see, I mean, could you just imagine Solomon right here watching his temple being built with all of these slaves, and he's just standing there, not participating, not lifting a finger? I mean, oftentimes church stays up here, but do we really explore what's happening underneath it? I mean, what we see here with the building of the temple, I would argue it's using religion as a weapon, a way to coerce others, using religion as a way to justify oppression, prejudice, dehumanization, greed. Have you ever seen religion used as a way to wield power over people? Well, I have it right. We have it right. We feel sorry for the rest of you who have it wrong. I mean, religion, sometimes it can be used to prop up the arrogant, to make people think, well, yeah, look at me. Little neck crack right there, right? Yeah. But in reality, a religion built on those principles that we just saw right here cannot stand if we follow the tradition of the temple. 2 Kings 25, on the 7th day of the 5th month. You all know that day, right? 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Nebuzaradan, maybe that's right. You guys try it. Commander of the imperial guard, an official of the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. He set fire to the temple of the Lord. Religion built on these principles cannot stand. This is not what God desires for religion, for a place where people go to worship God. So let's offer together 4 thoughts on the failed temple, because in reality, that's what it was. Read through the prophets. How often did the prophets speak against the religion of Israel? 4 thoughts on the failed temple or religion of Israel. First, you cannot buy or earn God's blessing. You can't buy God's blessing. You can't earn it by being really, really, really good. The truth is, the temple religion doesn't guarantee anything. Just because the temple was standing, just because people were going, it didn't guarantee anything for the Israelites. Here's Solomon, 22,000 cattle, 120,000 sheep. Was he trying to buy God's blessing with his wealth? Was he offering all these right things because it was his hope that if he did this, if he did all the right things, well, then God would continue to bless him with prosperity and with more? We were talking this week, beginning of school, we were reflecting back on some of the earlier weeks of school. And for our son, kindergarten did not go easily. He had a teacher, Mrs. White. Loved her. She was great. Probably close to retirement. She's been there for quite a while. She said she has never had a student like Reese before. And she's had quite a few students. Early on, there was a program that she would put on every single day. The kids would get up, they would dance around a little bit, then they would go sit back down, they'd get in line, go on to their next special or whatever they had going on at school. Reese refused to get up during, it's called Go Noodle, refused to get up and dance around during Go Noodle. Then he refused to get in line and move to gym, art, music, wherever the class happened to be going. One day, he sat there. Everyone else was up. Mrs. White said, "Reese, I need you to get in line." Reese goes, "How about I make a deal with you?" He was 5. Now, Mrs. White has told us this story. She said at this point, she had no idea what to do. Kindergarten teacher with over 20, 30 years experience. Never had a student like Reese. Did not know what to do in this moment. So she said the first thing that came naturally to her. She said, "Reese, Mrs. White does not make deals." I would argue that God does not make deals. You cannot get God to do your bidding by offering the correct prayers. You cannot get God to do your bidding by doing all the right Christian religious things. I know we try, but I don't believe that God makes deals. And sometimes we try to get God to do our bidding by slapping the label Christian on things. You ever noticed this before? I had someone once go to me, "I go to this dentist because he's a Christian." Okay, does he know teeth? I'm sorry if you're a Christian, you're a dentist. I mean nothing against you. But I have found this from time and time again, is that we try to justify our actions and we put that Christian label on it and just assume that God's going to bless the thing because it says Christian on it. As if you're any less Christian if you're just a dentist. You're not necessarily advertising it to everyone. God does not make deals. I have 2 things to say. If you are suffering, if you are going through hardship this morning, God is not punishing you. Sometimes we like to think that the hardships that we go through, the suffering that we experience in life is a result of where we've been, our past. If you are there this morning, if you are going through something right now, you are not being punished. God is always for you and with you in your suffering. Look at the example of Jesus. Where was God when Jesus was on the cross? Present on the cross with Jesus. Hardship does not equate God's punishment. Second, if you have been blessed, you are not better, you are not more favored than another. It doesn't mean that you are more religious than the person sitting next to you, that you have done more for God than the person you're sitting next to. You are to use your blessing, you are to see it as a gift and then use it as a way to go and bless others. Blessing and suffering are two of the greatest mysteries of life. Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Job wrestle with these complexities. The entire Bible wrestles with these complexities. Suffering and blessing, two of the greatest mysteries of life, and there is not an if-then formula to explain them. Second, God cares more about your heart than religious performance. I mentioned the prophet speaking about the temple. Here's God speaking through the prophet Amos. I hate, pretty strong language, I despise your religious festivals. What was Solomon doing? I despise your religious festivals. Your assemblies are a stench to me. Offerings were supposed to smell pleasant to the gods. That's why they were offered, because the aroma was supposed to waft up into the sky wherever the god happened to be, and then that smell. I was out cutting the lawn the other week, and Steph was cooking dinner, and we have that oven vent that just was putting all the air outside. I was so hungry cutting the lawn, was like, I want to finish cutting the lawn so I can go in and eat what it is she's cooking. That's the purpose of an offering. It was to be a pleasing aroma, yet here God says, your assemblies, the thing that you do when you gather together, stench to me. Even though you bring me burnt offerings, grain offerings, I will not accept them. Though you bring choice fellowship offerings, I'll have no regard for them. Away with the noise of your songs. Please, El, stop singing. Stop leading these people in worship. I will not listen to the music of your harps, but let justice roll on like a river. Justice, how we treat others. What we build a society on, how we treat those who we disagree with, the least of those around us, those with no power. God cares more about your heart than your religious performance. Number 3, third thought we learn about the failed temple. True religion is a collective pursuit built from a shared desire for God and his ways of living, rather than desire for power or religious control. Haggai, chapter 1. Haggai, another prophet, or Haggai would return after the exile with the Israelites, and here is what Haggai did. The Lord's messenger, he gave this message to the Lord, to the people. I am with you. The Lord stirred up the spirit of Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, the spirit of Joshua, son of Jozadak, the high priest, and the spirit of the whole remnant of the people. They began to work on the house of the Lord Almighty, their God. We read about the temple being destroyed by Babylon. Now, after the Israelites were exiled from their land, they were removed from their land, they are now returning to Israel. What's the first thing that they did? They repaired the temple. But what we find here is that the temple was being restored, was being repaired by the people, by everyone together. It wasn't just a king watching slaves, laborers do his bidding, but rather it was a collective experience, a collective work that all the people shared in together. I have a picture that describes beautifully shared desire for God and God's ways. It's a picture from our Awaken celebration at Joe and Laura's a couple weeks ago. We celebrated baptisms. We all gathered together out of a shared desire because we feel that we are in this together. Church is not about one person, not about a pastor, not about the leaders. It's about everyone together. The temple originally was built by a king who maybe wanted some control, maybe was trying to sway God to his side. But now things have changed. And the temple that had provided stability for people, well, that had been wiped away. And now the temple was being restored, but it wasn't built by just a king. He wasn't using his wealth only to build the temple, but rather all the people, the entire assembly came together out of a shared desire to worship God. to follow God, to maybe we can be different this time. Maybe we can learn from our mistakes. Maybe together we can experience the forgiveness, the grace, the healing, the mercy, the second chances that God offers. And maybe together, if we do this thing together, maybe then we can actually be a light for the world. And if we were to join together, maybe then we could actually show the world what Yahweh is really like. A God who doesn't build a religion on slavery, but rather a God who builds a religion on all people coming together and grace and forgiveness and mercy for all people. This, to me, is what Haggai looks like, a shared desire, us coming together for our own individual pursuit and also our communal pursuit together. And the fourth thought about the failed temple, stability is found in presence, not wealth, not power, not religious certitude. Stability is found in presence. Here's a picture of the exile, those who had had their lives torn apart, their certainty ripped away from them, their stability ripped away. Here they are sitting by the rivers of Babylon, removed from their homeland. And do you know what these exiles discovered? That God's presence was with them in exile. They thought when they were removed from the land, when they were removed from Israel, when the temple was destroyed, they thought, that's it, it's over. God has abandoned us. God's presence will not travel with us across the land. But in reality, the exiles found that even in a distant land, even when they were removed from everything that they knew, God's healing, restoring presence was still with them. We'll get to this later. I know our time's running out. So let's end here with this one. What time is it anyway? Oh, yeah. Okay. We'll end with this. And like I said, I think we're going to do another week on the temple because 17 sermons. Can't pack it into one. Matthew 27. Jesus is on the cross. When Jesus had cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit. Jesus has died. Immediately, what does Matthew tell us happens after Jesus dies? At this moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two, from top to bottom. The curtain, behind the curtain, was not the Great Oz. Behind the curtain was where God's presence supposedly was. When Jesus dies, that separation, that curtain that signified God's here, you're out there, you can't approach God because God's presence is so holy and so in there, and you can't mingle with that presence. But when Jesus dies, that curtain, that symbolism is torn in half, almost as if to say, God's presence is coming out. God's presence is not contained here in this space, but rather God's presence is all around. Stability is found in presence. A presence that travels with you wherever you go. Even if you find yourself in exile, even if you find yourself wandering in a distant land, whether it be from mistakes possibly that you have made and you keep beating yourself up over those mistakes, or whether it has just happened to you and you find yourself in a distant country, God's healing presence is there with you. And when Jesus died, this temple, this curtain being torn in two, God says, you can't contain me here. You've thought for so long this is where I am, but in reality, I'm out there with you, leading and guiding. So the temple tried to contain God's presence. And all throughout the Bible, we find a God who pushes back against that and says, no, I'm not just here, I'm everywhere. May you live with that truth, and may you discover the Spirit that leads, guides, and heals wherever your feet walk.